Following Reconstruction, Southerners started talking about a new South. And what they meant by that was that the South was starting to look like the North. The biggest promoter of it was a guy named Henry Grady. And by looking like the North, by the New South, what they mean is three very specific things: railroads, urbanization, and industrialization. And the first one, they were correct about. The South, after the Civil War, it got a lot of railroads. The railroads were destroyed during the Civil War, and there was a railroad boom in the South. And the South became connected to the North. So railroads definitely did start growing. Second part of that, urbanization. And there was some growth in cities. There were some cities that, a lot of cities expanded significantly, only if they got a railroad. And that was the contingent factor. If a city got a railroad, then it had a chance of growing. If it didn't get a railroad, then it would stagnate or decline. So as long as a railroad came into a city, then it would grow. And there are a lot of cities that grew significantly. But it was a lot of growth for the fact that they didn't have big cities before that. So relative to what the South had before, yes, they did have more cities that grew a lot, but it was not urbanizing by any stretch of the imagination. I'm going to use Texas as an example because we live in Texas and I know a lot about Texas history. So just as an example, in Texas, there were some cities that did grow, but by 1900, around 80% of the population still lived in rural areas. So that is enormous. The South will lag behind the North by decades. So there was some urbanization, and if you looked at it in terms of, well, look how much this city grows, and look how much this city grows, and look how many cities have grown, then relative to the South, it had grown. But relative to the nation overall, it was still pretty far behind. The third part of that, industrialization. And make sure you read about this in your textbook, but there was industrialization. There were growth of industries, and of course, it was tied to the railroad also. The only way you could have manufacturing in the South is if a railroad was connected to the manufacturing establishment or had access to it. That way, the railroads could, one, get the raw material, or the manufacturing companies, industry, could get the raw material to them, and then they could process it, and then they could ship it out to distant markets. So there was growth in manufacturing, especially relative to what it had been before. However, even with all the growth, there are two caveats. Even with all the growth in manufacturing, Texas still lagged, or the South in general still lagged behind the North. And so in 1860, right before the Civil War, about 10% of manufacturing was done in the South, and decades later, even during the New South, the number was still true. So while there was growth in the South, relative to the North, it was still just a tiny, tiny fraction. And the other caveat to industrialization is that a lot of the industrialization that took place was what you'd call extractive industrialization. So textiles are turning cotton into shirts, lumber, cutting down trees and cutting up the trees for stuff. Oil will become important. Well, it doesn't even come as important till later. So there is manufacturing, but it is not advanced manufacturing. So while the North is getting into, the North is producing steel and iron and these electricity, and it's involved in advanced manufacturing, the South manufacturing is decades and decades behind. So overall, there was growth, and you could point to some things to show growth. But the South remained overwhelmingly rural and based on agriculture. And ironically enough, a big reason that it will stay based on agriculture is because of the railroads also. And we will talk about that later when we talk about Gilded Age, agricultural protest during the Gilded Age. Overall, what the New South creed was, it was a creed. It was something Southerners said and they promoted. It's called boosterism, trying to boost up your city and trying to get everyone excited about it, and especially trying to get Northern capital, Northern banks, to invest their money in the South. But it was more rhetoric than reality. So that is what the New South is. And obviously, for Southerners, it is not nearly as important as the Old West. The part of U.S. history that is especially popular in Texas is, of course, the Old West. Now, make sure you read about this in the textbook. I'm only going to be talking about a couple parts about it, and I'm especially going to be focusing on Texas. Overall, the Old West, and please do not send me hate mail, is just an incredibly exaggerated period of U.S. history in general and Texas history especially. And when I say exaggerated, it is a very, very short period of time. From after the Civil War till about 1890. And so in terms of how long of a period it lasted, it is very, very short in terms of the economic impact of the Old West. Of the industries or economics of it, it's just not economically significant. And also, it represented only a very small fraction of the population. So you kind of think of the Old West in terms of how many people were involved in what we would consider the Old West. It's like the flapper girls in the 20s. It was not a huge part of the population. So, obviously a big part of the Old West. Well, in imagination, we think of the Old West as cowboys, Indians, and especially the theme of every Old West movie, which is where most people get everything they understand about the Old West, is from movies. The biggest theme is individualism. People that do it all on their own, they don't need help with anything. And that's just not factually correct. The reason I say that is because a huge part of the Old West being able to happen even was because of the U.S. military. The U.S. military will be instrumental in pushing out the Native Americans, and so settlers could come in and start settling these towns. The only reason the Old West could happen was because the U.S. military came in first and pushed out the people who were already there. So Native Americans had a huge presence, but when the U.S. Army started pushing in, especially when they started getting, when they had railroads and when they had transportation routes, Then Native Americans, their time was very limited in how long they could withstand Anglo-Americans moving west. And so, to give you the example of Texas, the U.S. military would establish a series of bases, and this will happen throughout all of the United States. The U.S. military will establish bases, but it especially was important in Texas for two reasons. Partly because Texas had some of the most dangerous Native American tribes, specifically the Comanches. They were a mean group, and the Apaches, but especially the Comanches, who were very highly mobile. So the U.S. military started by setting up bases all throughout Texas, and this went in phases. And obviously, a lot of these bases, where they set up base, then people would start moving into that base because now they had protection, and then they would grow. The best example is base in Worth, Fort Worth. Obviously, will grow huge. So in 1849, the U.S. military will establish a string of forts, and then in 1854, they established even more forts, going all the way out to Fort Bliss. So they'll get all the way out to El Paso, and another string of forts in 1860. So the U.S. military will gradually bring more forts out, and will essentially drive out the Native Americans and also provide protections from Mexico, since Texas was one of the only places with two enemies, I guess you'd say, that the population need protection from. So just to give you an idea of how instrumental the U.S. military was in this, from the time that Texas was annexed into the United States until about the 1890s, Texas was the single largest expenditure of the U.S. military. About 30% of the entire U.S. military's budget went into this one state. And all that money went into these bases. And obviously, the soldiers at these bases would have to buy goods from Texans, and then buy supplies and buy their labor for things. So it greatly expanded Texas's economy. The most famous part of the Old West, and this is really going to get me hate mail, but the Cattle Kingdom and cowboys. The Cattle Kingdom was a short period, and it was actually based, the whole reason it started was because of the Civil War. During the Civil War, northern livestock were completely depleted to feed the U.S. Army during the war. So right after the war ended, the North did not have a lot of cattle, so demand for cattle in the North was absolutely huge. To put a number behind it, Longhorn in Texas, you could sell for about $3 to $6. If you took that exact same Longhorn and you sold it in the North, you could get about $30 or $40. So that is a huge amount. So Texans started these massive cattle drives where they would bring thousands and thousands of cattle from Texas up north, up to Kansas, where the closest railroad line was. They'd load them onto the railroad cars, and they'd go up to Chicago, where they'd then be processed, turned into canned meat, what have you. And there were tons of these trails, the most famous, the Chisholm Trail. Just to give you an example or an idea of how big this was, in 1866 alone, so the year right after the Civil War, more than 250,000 cattle were driven north along these routes. So that leads us to the hallmark, the most iconic part of the Wild West, the cowboys. And cowboys, again, it was a small part of the population, and they really, in a lot of ways, resembled the flappers, except the male version of the flappers, in that they get so much attention, and they were a very, very small part of the population. And also, this is where I'm pretty sure I'll get some hate mail. Cowboys, being a cowboy was not a glamorous job, and it wasn't at all what most people think. Most cowboys were younger than 20, and so they basically were individuals that would be hired per cattle, per ride. So they would be hired for that one thing, and that's it. Most of them were Anglo-Americans, and 1/3 were either black or Hispanic. They made about $40 a month or less, which at the time even was not very good. And they would herd about 3,000 cattle at a time. And so they would be moving about 10 to 15 miles a day, and it would take about 6 weeks to get there. There was a trail boss, or the guy that's in charge. He's like, in construction terms, he's like the foreman. And then there would be 10 cowboys. One of them would be the cook that would be in the wagon, and he would always be at the front. And then you would have a wrangler that would have all the extra horses in case some got away, and they were usually at the front with the trail boss. And then the remainder of the cowboys would surround the herd, and there was whoever was the newest and the youngest would be in the very back, because that was the absolute worst, because you had to smell everything that was in front of you. And these jobs were incredibly slow, monotonous, and boring. They were not exciting. And if there was excitement, the excitement came from bad weather, stampedes, if the cows got spooked and started running, or you had to cross a river. So life was good if it was very slow and plodding and boring, which it usually was. If it was exciting, then it was not something good. Bad weather, rivers, or stampedes. And here's the real kicker. Most cowboys did not carry guns. Most cowboys were not allowed to carry guns. The foreman, the trail boss, would not let them. They were not allowed to, because if, as happens sometimes, one of them shot a gun, then the cows would just stampede in the other direction. And that was a disaster. So there would be guns, but they would be in the wagon with the cook. So it was, in general, a really, really boring job. And if you wanted to compare it to something today, it would be a contractor, or someone that you hire for a construction job that doesn't work for a company, and you a lot of the times pay them by the day or by the week or by the job, and they have absolutely no job stability. They tend to be younger, and at the time even, this was not considered a glamorous job. So people didn't look at it like, oh my gosh, cowboys are so great, which obviously we do now, but it was not considered glamorous at all. Again, cowboys, it is the most iconic part of the Wild West, and it was a much less glamorous part than most people think. And again, it only lasted a very short time, because what will end the whole cowboy culture and also the cattle kingdom is technology, specifically railroads. It's called the Iron Horse. And when railroads started coming into the South, then it made cowboys completely, it made the whole cattle kingdom, cattle trails, cowboys, obsolete. They were unnecessary. And the railroads, they came in pretty quick. So railroads will change everything about American society and everything about Americans' lives. And they are responsible for the end of the most iconic parts of the Old West. I'll give you an example. Here's 1860. The entire North is connected by railroads. The South has some, but are scattered. 10 years later, we have a transcontinental railroad, and there are more railroad lines. But by the time we get to 1890s, there is no place where you could not get where railroads did not touch that the cattle kingdom was useful for. So instead of having to walk the cattle up to Kansas, now all of a sudden you could be in Houston, Texas, and load all the cattle up, Fort Worth, and load all the cattle up there. So the Old West was a very, very small part of U.S. history. It, of course, has a huge, huge part of American memory and American lore, and especially the cowboys themselves. But it is something that at the time was not glamorous and was made glamorous by movies. So that is the New South and the Old West. Be sure to read the notes in the textbook.